magnetic impact country. Let's ride.
Perfect.
So today we're going to talk about structural assessment versus functional assessment in terms of things that we look for during our patient interactions.
So let's just get to talking. We're going to be hanging out and loosely talking about this topic. So first, let's define it. You brought up a good point earlier. How do you differ the functional versus structural assessments, and how do you define that? Where's your definition lie?
That's a great question. I also think, like, if just to tie it into it before I actually give you an answer, this also plays into like any personal trainer or strength coach that has a physical exam as part of like what they do. And are they looking at structural versus functional things? And they probably are, and how do they define that? But structural would be like related to like assessing a range of motion or a joint, how mobile or immobile something may be perceived, basing it off a no normative value or a suggested normative value, versus a functional exam where you're looking at like a capacity of the person to do something with a movement or movement quality or load. For example, a jump. What happens when you jump? What does that look like? That's going to be a very functional exam, right? It's going to carry over to how that athlete moves in a functional way related to jumping. That would be like how I kind of define those two different things. What are some examples that you could say are like very common functional exams and very common structural exams that you see?
I think going back to what you're saying about like a jump and the range of motion, I think we always want to check if the person have access to those range of motions in terms of like those normative values. Can they get into those positions that they need to access in order to produce that movement? If they don't have that ability to get into those positions on the table test, and then they have to go demonstrate the functional movement, then we might see deficiencies, or we kind of check their movement strategies, like how do they look on the table versus how they actually move. I think that's what very important, understanding where those basic biomechanics are at first.
Yeah, and then correlation, and is anything meaningful, right? Sometimes, I don't know if you've ever experienced where you'll go on to like a table test with somebody, and the table test has augmented motion, or it just seems limited on what we do on the table, and then we move them into an environment where there's more stress on their body and a more functional exam, and it doesn't always correlate to poor movement quality. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes it does, right? So when we do these exams, and this is why like all systems in some way are broke, but we all need a framework to work in, or we're broke, right? So trying to understand, am I creating meaning to something where there's no meaning, right? Like I found the flaw with this particular table test, then I bring this guy out here, and then he moves great when he's under load. All of a sudden his range of motion improves, or her range of motion improves. What I saw on that table, that correlate to anything meaningful when I brought him into the functional exam. So understanding that, and then sometimes too, you can, more often than not, you'll bring somebody through a low threshold thing like a table test, range of motion, and then it's great, and then we bring them out to like a more functional exam, like what happens when we put load on them, and then everything goes haywire, right? So it's, do we see a grouping of multiple things together that correlate to something meaningful for the person, or are we just creating something meaningful to something that we find?
Yeah. And for me, I think like simply, like I look at it as what does the anatomy that person's working with, and then how do they use that anatomy. And those table tests are great to check out and see how that anatomy is, and also good to rule out any things that we think need additional imaging or something that we would butt our heads against if we did a whole bunch of functional stuff. And once we clear that stuff out, then, like you said, oftentimes the functional stuff can be very achievable.
Yeah, so let's talk about something that I think has like a lot of controversy around it. It has a lot of back and forth pros and cons, and I definitely think it doesn't fit in any exact box. And rib position during overhead movement. So what I mean by that is the concept of a rib flare, right? Like what is going on in the trunk? Do the ribs move upward when the person moves? Like is there a strategy where there's maybe not enough extension? We see what we might consider an excessive rib flare. And based off a person's anatomy, is it even achievable for that person to bring their arms all the way overhead without any kind of rib flare? And is that person going to be boxed in for the rest of their life of doing exercises in a plane where we don't encourage a full overhead motion because we're overly cueing, or we really want to focus on what's going on in one place, right? As human beings, we're designed to be able to achieve things, right? You set a goal, and the harder you make it, the more you see form break, the harder they try to get it, but they reach it and attain it. I think that's an area where there's shades of gray on what you're trying to do with a person. How do you feel about that?
I think that's great. I think we shouldn't always put limitations on people in terms of putting them in a box, like limiting into movements. I think with the assessments, we can find what they're currently at and then create a program and meet them where they're at and apply where their range of motions is like, hey, you're going to tolerate this certain range. That's where we slowly expose them to that certain range and build strength in those areas. And over time, hopefully we can see gradual changes instead of just putting them in the box like, hey, just because you can't reach overhead, you can't lift things over your head or perform overhead movements.
Yeah, and maybe we need to back up if anybody's not clear on what I mean by using the terminology of rib flare or centration or position of what's going on here. Rib flare would be when I am reaching up, what happens to my rib cage? Do I reach up here? Am I able to keep my ribs unflared or pulled down or locked? Or do I have to come unglued to get up? Or is there a place in between there that's it's all good? Like, is there an in-between of that feels good?
Exactly.
Yeah. I think oftentimes, I think it's common that we place too much emphasis on having perfect form. We meaning like physical therapists, chiropractors, trainers. I think the great, to the point you said, is like meeting somebody where they're at. Like what do they want to do? Where are they at currently? And what can they do? And can we encourage them to build on what they have currently? Mm-hmm. And even if there is like a structural deficit that's going to prevent them to get into that position, we can't discourage them because we don't know for certain if extending at the back is going to cause issues down the line. But we can use that to modify symptoms, and it's very great to modify symptoms. As clinicians, we can modify symptoms when somebody has back pain, for that example, and we can teach them how to not extend at the back because it's pissed off. Right? And then we can gradually expose them to extending at the back again, and then build the confidence in moving and encourage physical activity. I think encouraging the physical activity is the most important point because there are too many barriers for physical activities when we place that point on perfection. Not that it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
because that
you're not trying to say, you're not emphasizing let's be sloppy coaches.
Correct.
Right? Like when you see a movement pattern and it looks like a completely different thing than you were trying to have them do, you want to be able to give them some coaching and maybe put them in the right spot or a better way to move. But also too, you want to give them, and I've seen you do this with a lot of success, Kevin, you want to give them an opportunity to be successful, right? Like think about anything you do for the first time or haven't done in a long time. When you first go do it, it's probably not going to be awesome. And it's not, no matter what I tell you, those next 3, 5, 10 reps are not going to be awesome. Are you going to learn that by me shutting up and just giving you maybe some constraints, like get by a wall or do something better than me over-coaching every single motion of those next 10 reps, right? So finding the balance of not over-coaching them, giving them an opportunity to succeed, right? So let me try this. This is what we're trying to do. Okay, get a little feedback, give it an opportunity to learn. And then we kind of go from there. And I've seen you be really successful with that. And I've seen me be really unsuccessful the other way, right? Like just overly coaching those first reps and not giving the person enough time to figure it out.
I think there's also understanding the person in front of you too, like how they respond in terms like external versus internal cues. Some people respond really well to external. Some people do well with internal. I think finding the person that you're in front of you actually spending time with them over time, learning how they learn. That's the most biggest thing that I found valuable. Understand the person in front of you, and then that way you can teach them better.
Well, until next time, follow us on our YouTube channel. Message us if you need anything, info@kirehab.com, or you can find us on Instagram @Kinetic Impact. Reach out to us, let us know what you want to hear about. If you got questions, we're more than happy to help. It's been fun hanging out.
You could also hit up this man on his social individually at
Dr. Kevin Leon. Kinetic Impact Nation,
We out.
we out.